Hey everybody, I hope that you had a wonderful weekend. Today I'm popping in to talk to you about podcasting. So, I have had a lot of friends who have started podcasts since I started my podcast, and they had a lot of questions. And I was thinking that, a lot of you may be considering starting a podcast too. And so, I would share some insight with you if you're thinking about starting a podcast. So, if you've seen some of my announcements, you know that I have been hosting the Be Heard podcast for about 3 years. And I've tried some different things. I've tried different scheduling. I've definitely learned a lot and had to take some breaks because the first thing that I will share with you about podcasting is that it's very time consuming, especially if you are looking at it and you've decided to invest more of your time than more of your money. And of course, there are always different ways to do things. This is just my personal way, but it definitely takes up a lot of time. And so I'll go through and share some of those steps with you. But also, just a reminder that next week is launch week for the rebrand of my podcast, which will now be the Magnetic Entrepreneur Podcast. I think that it's a good integrated move since we have the Facebook group and all of you to continue having some of these conversations. And in both places, we talk about marketing and mindset and how to create a business that you really love by using this combination of strategy and mindset. So, that is happening next week, and I would really love your support. So, if you haven't listened before, if you have listened before, either way, I would love for you to hop on and leave a rating and review next week and help me relaunch this podcast. Rating and reviews, the reason why every podcaster asked for them is because that's how you can get your podcast heard by more people. Of course, it's getting to be a more and more crowded space, but the rating and reviews really help for a multitude of ways. So, if you are wanting to be on podcast and be a guest on podcasts, then the rating and reviews matter because you want to make sure that you are getting on a podcast which has some reach to it. If you are creating a podcast, you want that reach because, as I'll talk about more in detail, podcasts can be very time consuming. They can be very expensive. And so that's the way that you can get something back for your hard work, is knowing that you're being able to get your message out to as many people as possible. And it also helps when you're getting guests. So I have a lot of people reach out to me and want to be guests. There are people that I reach out to and ask them if they'll be guests, and they feel the same way. They want to know that they are showing up on a platform that is going to get some reach, especially if that's the reason why they're there, which, most of the time it is. And so those rating and reviews really matter, and that's why people always ask for them. So I am asking for you to help me relaunch the podcast, which starts next week as the Magnetic Entrepreneur Podcast. And I'll put a link here. I think it's going to be the same thing, but there'll be lots of stuff in the group about that. So I'm just looking at my list here. The first thing that you have to consider if you're thinking about starting a podcast is, what are you doing it for? What's your intent? I always think that being really clear about your intention when you start something new is really important, because when you're very clear on what you want out of it, then it helps kind of pull you through in times when maybe it's a little bit hard, or you're having to be very specific about your strategy and the steps that you are taking. So if you want to start a podcast just because you feel like there's something that you really want to talk about or share, your intention may be different than someone who starts a podcast because they really want to use that as a platform to build their business. So they want to stand out as an expert in their field, and they want to use that to leverage people, just like some people choose to show up in Facebook groups. Some people choose to use Instagram as a way to create a platform for the things that they want to talk about, and then have the people that are interested, go on to work with them. So really be clear about the intention. When I started the Be Heard podcast, it's not that I didn't want it to grow my business, but that was definitely not my intention at all. But after realizing how much time, and then especially when I got to the point where I was paying someone to help me with the podcast, then it did become important to me to grow my business, but my business also changed. So what I was doing when I launched the podcast versus changing into business coaching and focusing on marketing and strategy was very different. So the podcast had to be different, and I took some different steps along the way to really use it to shift people to generate leads, which was different than my intention in the beginning. So that is something really important to really think about. What is my intention here? What is it that I really want? Am I creating a space to lift other people up and share their message? Or am I creating a space to maybe do all of those things and grow your business? So be really clear about what your intention is. The second thing is you have to know that there is a trade-off here. So the trade-off for creating a platform, for generating leads in this fashion, for establishing your expertise is time and or money, probably a combination of both. And I'll just give you a little bit of a behind the scenes of what it takes to actually execute a podcast on my end. So first of all, you've got to have a list of topics of things that you feel like are interesting, that are really going to be good for your listeners. And if you're being strategic about it, you really want to look at keywords and see what kind of things are people really interested in hearing about right now, because those episodes will get more play. So you've got to be strategic about that. And even if you don't seek out experts on those topics, you still want to keep that in mind when you are creating the title of your podcast. And I definitely, as when I started, wasn't really concerned about this. It was just whatever felt interesting to me. That's what I wanted to talk about. So as I have decided to use it more to grow my business, I've definitely gotten more specific about that, like looking at keywords and doing a little research. So that takes time. Then, of course, you have to contact guests, and you have to have a system for contacting guests, letting them know everything they need to know to show up for the podcast, scheduling the podcast. Then there's the recording of the podcast, the editing of the podcast. Then there's a follow through with guests. So whenever I have a guest on and they share the podcast, which you would think would be a no-brainer if you're going on a podcast to get more visibility, like why wouldn't you share that? But I've definitely had guests that haven't, and you can tell the difference. If a guest shares the podcast with their own network, there's about a 50% increase in people that download the podcast. So that can be quite significant, right? And then when you think about like how much time you've spent doing all the things for that guest to not share, it's not that great. It's not that great, right? So that's another thing, is you want to make it as easy as possible to ensure that the guest is going to share with their network. And the ways that I do that are creating a series of graphics so that they can share them on their own platforms. Then, of course, I share them on my platform, tag them. That generates a little bit of back and forth. I also create swipe copy, and that's just copy that they can use to easily put in their social media post or their newsletter to make it so easy for them to share the episode that they couldn't not do it. But there's one more thing that's a little bit of something to consider too, which is why a lot of times it's great to work farther out, because guests will often have a team that does their social media and things like that for them. And so they've got a content schedule. And if you say, hey, your episode's live and it's the day of, or, I really try to do it beforehand, because if they've already gotten all their content laid out, then they might not be able to actually share the episode when the episode is live. And so that means that if they share it later, someone's got to go back through and look at it. So it's really important to keep a podcast schedule and know when these episodes are going live, when is the date that you need to let the person know about the episode. All those things, all those little steps really matter, so you can see how this is starting to add up, right? So it's even after you have the episode recorded, like recording the episode is the easiest part. You have to make sure that it gets edited on time. You've got to look at your calendar. You have to make sure to let the guests know. You've got to make the graphics. You've got to share the graphics. You have to update your website with the relevant content so that you're getting some extra keywords. You have all of these different steps that you have to take. So there's a lot of time involved. And then if you actually edit your own episodes, that could be, an unlimited amount of time. Now, some people don't really edit that much of their episodes, and other people do. Mine is very free-flowing and conversational. So sometimes it takes more editing just because we're chit-chatting beforehand, we're chit-chatting afterwards, and I've got to cut that out and just give you guys the best portion of that. Also, sometimes we just have really long conversations, and I try to keep the episodes a little bit shorter. They used to run more like an hour, sometimes longer, but now I try to keep them around 45 minutes. I feel like that's a good amount of time. Again, a lot of this comes down to personal preference, but even if you do zero editing, you still have to do the introductory part. You still have to put some music to it. And, sound quality to me is the most important thing. I mean, how many times have you heard a podcast where there was a lot of noise in the background? Or one time I was listening to a podcast and I thought it was a pretty big podcaster, and I'm surprised that they actually aired the episode because it sounded like the person was in the kitchen having a conversation with like a kid and a husband and all that. Like she wasn't even present for the entire interview. And it was horrible. I listened to about 10 minutes and I just couldn't take it anymore. It was awful. So those are the reasons why, when you really start to think about it and you start to write down the steps of all the things you have to do, it really is a lot of work. But it is totally worth it because podcasting is definitely one of my favorite things that I like to do, and especially when it comes to growing my business. I mean, I do it for nothing. I mean, I'm not trying to get sponsors or anything like that. I really enjoy it and all the relationships that I've made in the process. So, probably only maybe a year and a half ago or so, started trying to do really specific things to grow my business. But before that, I mean, it was just a labor of love, and I absolutely love it. So if you're thinking about it, really take these kind of things into consideration. But I don't think that you'll regret it either way because it's a wonderful experience. And when we're talking about marketing these podcasts, a few things to consider is a lot of people wonder, oh, should I do solo episodes? Should I do interviews? And I'll kind of talk about some pros and cons, kind of things back and forth, in case that is something that is on your mind and you're trying to consider what you might want to do. So you've probably figured out at this point in your business that the more specific you are, the faster you get traction, and it's because people know exactly what to expect. And so when you can be very specific, they know what they're showing up for, they know what they're getting, and you're attracting them because you're solving something specific that they want to know more about. I think the same thing is true in podcasting. If you're trying to grow your business, you want to listen to podcasts that are going to talk about the specific topics that you're curious about when it comes to growing your business. If you love crime shows and mysteries and things like that, that's what you're looking for when it comes to more entertainment and things. So apply that same principle if you're going to start a podcast, and think about how you can be really specific with your audience. And it's okay that if you have a podcast that's not just straight up interviews type of questions, if you wrap it inside of a story, right? So most good marketing is specific and actionable, but it's inside a story. That's what kind of makes it interesting. It's what makes it stick with us. And that's a really fun part of podcasting. But when you are talking about the description of your podcast, when you're naming your podcast, think about how specificity is really going to make you stand out, especially as more and more people are podcasting. And I think another thing that really makes you stand out is what I spoke about earlier, which is quality. It's not even just the interview, it's the sound quality. Like, make sure that what you're doing is quality, that when you decide that you're going to do a podcast, that is something that's on your mind, is knowing that there may be a financial trade-off, there may be a time trade-off, to make sure that you have that quality of guest, quality of sound, and quality of interview. So a few things that will help you if you were talking about marketing your podcast is, again, using those keywords and making sure that you are being conscientious about the title of your podcast, about the episodes inside of your podcast. And when you're thinking about solo versus interview, that can also help you get a lot more traction if you have interviews, because of what I spoke to earlier, which is having a guest means that you're tapping into their audience, just like they're tapping into your audience. And so you get more bang for your buck, so to say, by having that double reach. But also you have to trade off the time to make it really easy for them, because even though it seems like a no-brainer, a lot of people still won't share. So it really goes back and forth. I like to do a mix of solo and interview episodes, and that decision was really based on me using the podcast to grow my business, because before, when it wasn't about that, there was really no need for me to do a solo episode, and I enjoy interview episodes more, so that's why I often use recordings of brain went completely blank, recordings of coaching sessions, because I feel like that is really helpful, and it's a good way to help give people tips and things that they need. And so what I'll do is take a section out of a call that's about a really specific topic. So not like the whole thing is usually in calls where you kind of bounce around and talk about a multitude of things. But when we get really specific, so if we're specifically talking about social media or email list or something like that, I will take that part out so that it's really specific, like we were talking about, and make that into a shorter episode that is really just about that. So I'll speak about the topic in the beginning for the introductory part. I will share that coaching snippet, and then I will talk about how people can work with me. So I love sharing the free calls, because that's a really great way to let people know what to expect, right? So if you listen to the podcast, you'll get to hear me coaching somebody, so you know if that is the right style of coaching for you. So I really love to mix them up. And then sometimes I just do solo episodes where I'll talk about a specific topic, especially if it's one that I feel like I'm talking about a lot, then I know that it's something that other people would like to hear. And those episodes usually get a good amount of downloads. So if you're considering what should you do, I really think that it depends on what type of business you have. And really, again, thinking about the first thing that we talked about, which is, what is your intent with this podcast? Where are you hoping that it is going to go? What is your purpose in doing this? Because that's really going to answer a lot of the questions that you have. So again, I am going to be updating my podcast to the Magnetic Entrepreneur podcast next week, and I would love to have your support. If you would pop in iTunes, leave a rating and review. There's going to be I'll be talking about this a lot more, because I'm really excited about it. It's really the accumulation of a lot of things that have been happening as my business has been shifting and changing. Like you all know, that entrepreneurship is not linear, and so it's just kind of catching up with other things that are happening inside of my business. And if you have any questions about podcast, I would love to answer them for you. Anything you want to know, if it's about technology, who my editor is, anything like that. I feel like I've gotten it down to a pretty straightforward system at this point. I have a podcast editor. I have a VA that helps me. So I just do the recordings, pick the guest, and write everything out. And my wonderful VA takes that and she makes the graphics, and she contacts the guest, and she follows up with them, and all of that wonderful stuff. So it has made it so much easier. But again, if you have any questions, pop them in the comments below, and I'd be happy to answer any of those for you.